So gentleness, as we kind of talk about how it's acted in our lives or how the Bible talks about it and why we want it, I kind of pulled out a couple different things where we see gentleness being addressed in the Bible. And one of the verses that I came across was interesting to me because it talked about gentleness being attractive. And you don't necessarily think of that, but I think maybe when I was originally wanting to be more gentle with my kids and not yelling across the playground, it was, in a sense, attractive to me because I didn't want to be annoying. So maybe it was the opposite of that. But 1 Peter 3, verses 3 and 4 tells us to let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So when we are gentle, it's precious to God. And the Bible tells us that that can be kind of our adorning, rather than having to put on jewelry to make us attractive or likable. Here we're seeing it as gentleness can be that almost physical attraction to us. I don't know if you ever see that in people, or if you find that as something that would attract you to somebody you want to be friends with.
Oh, totally. And I mostly see it in a few women that I really admire that are older than me, that I see, I'm like, they're just so beautiful, and you just want to be near them. And I, sometimes step back and I'm like, it's not like we dress the same. It's not like I want, it's not that. It's something much deeper. It's that heart. It's that face. It's the face that looks at another human being and goes, you're a beautiful person. That's just, you're right. Who doesn't feel beautiful back to that,
Right.
And you rise to be your best self when someone's treating you that way too. So you end up seeing the beauty in others as well as the beauty in yourself. I love that.
Yeah. Another thing that we see from gentleness, which is kind of interesting, I think a lot of people might misconstrue gentleness as weakness, that if we're just so gentle all the time, maybe it's because we don't have the strength to make a difference or to try to make a change in something. But in reality, the Bible talks about how gentleness is really powerful, because Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1, as an example, says, a soft answer or a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs anger. And I think, just like Proverbs always does, it has such a concise, perfect way of saying things that are just so true. Because when we're faced with gentleness, it's easier to be gentle. But I think the hardest thing and what requires that self-control is when we're not faced with gentleness.
Totally.
And then we respond with not gentleness. But if we can change that, if we can have our self-control to respond gently, then it has the power to kind of diffuse the rest of the tension and the rest of the aggression that's in the room.
It's so true.
Yeah, especially with our kids. I mean, you talk about like time being so hard to show that gentleness through it. But I find that a lot of times that's because there's just so much chaos happening at one time.
Yeah.
And so we're all reacting to the chaos, right?
It's so true.
Yeah, but if we can just stop for a moment, have gentleness, it turns it all around.
It does. Every time. And it is harder to do this to say, for sure. When you have so much going on, sometimes it just feels like the faster you go, the better it's going to be. You'll just get through it. And it's the kingdom of opposites. It is, when you slow down and you connect with that individual and you can be gentle to yourself in the moment, it turns everything around. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I see it sometimes too, not just in the way I treat my kids, but sometimes, unfortunately, the way I treat my husband. You maybe aren't always so compassionate with them because you think they're strong enough to be able to take it. But then if we're somewhat aggressive in our behavior towards them, instead of gentle, then all of a sudden it turns them with that same aggression back, and we get all this tension in our marriages.
Right.
And that's so difficult. But if we can remember to even be gentle with those we think who are strong, it makes all the difference.
It really does. I think inside we're all little people just growing. I mean, we're all growing and learning and changing. And if we can see the root behind it and just be gentle with that and take good care of each other at the very core of our beings.
Yeah.
Of course. Who wouldn't respond gently back to that again?
Right.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah. So there's a couple other verses that talk about gentleness being powerful. One of them comes out of Psalm 18 that I thought was interesting. David is praising God, and in verse 35 he says, "You've given me the shield of your salvation, your right hand supports me, and your gentleness has made me great." It's interesting to think about how God could have been gentle with David to help him be great in all that he did. Just a little bit of gentleness turned David great.
Right.
Yeah, there's another one that comes out of Galatians 6, verse 1. It says, "Dear brothers and sisters, if another Christian is overcome by some sin, you who are godly should gently and humbly help that person back onto the right path." So here again, we're seeing power, the power of gentleness to restore someone. That you could try so many different ways to bring someone back. You could punish them, you could yell at them, you could, do all these things to correct behavior. But the thing that's going to work best is to gently address the issue and help restore them that way.
Totally. Yeah, this is such a timely thing for me to get to participate with you on this devotional, because it has been such a trying couple of weeks for us with just we have our adoption date coming up, and it's just going to relaunch a whole bunch of fears for our kids, and just these fears come out very angry with there have not been some pretty moments where we have not responded back gently, particularly my daughter and I, where we can just butt heads and can be cruel, and at the end of the day we both looked at each other. There's one particular bad fight this last weekend, and there was this moment of, I didn't mean anything I said, me neither, fresh start, and we moved on. But that gentleness, where we did it so wrong, and then we're able to do it the right way, and it didn't resolve anything, it didn't make it easier, it felt better,
Yeah.
Our hearts connected, even though didn't change anything necessarily.
So the other thing that we can look at as we look at gentleness is the idea of meekness. I think when we talk about gentleness, so often it might seem simple. Not necessarily simple to enact, but the idea itself is simple. But then you hear the Beatitudes from Jesus, and he says, "Blessed are the meek." And we look at that and we think, what does that mean?
Right.
or a lot of people immediately think, oh, the weak must be meek because, they're lowly or whatever the case may be. But the interesting thing, a lot of scholars will define meekness as strength under control. So here we're talking about gentleness as powerful, and we see that meekness is actually a sign of strength. But when we talk about it being under control, it's because you're submitting to Jesus or to God and his ways. And so we're not necessarily trying to always express everything that we want or our emotions out fully. We're submitting to God. In the Bible app on one of the reading plans, a metaphor for meekness was a racehorse. Racehorses are super strong and powerful, but instead of acting like a bucking bronco that you might see at a rodeo or something, the racehorse is submitting to their rider, and the rider just has to make a gentle move one way or the other, and that racehorse in all of its power responds to that and races the race. Or I think we can look at it with ourselves in our parenting. We, are stronger than our children. So we could parent them through force. We could parent them by making them do the things that we want, by physically moving them or however. And unfortunately, that's probably how a lot of kids end up in foster care because their parents are parenting with force in some cases. So we have the power to act that way if we wanted to, but instead we're going to use our strength, but under control, under our self-control and under the control of God, realizing that they're his children. So this idea of meekness is just so interesting to me as we talk about gentleness and trying to submit ourselves and our behavior to God.
I've never quite thought about meekness that way. In fact, I just read through the Beatitudes earlier this week, and to hear it said that way, I'm like, that is very powerful hearing it that way.
So as we think of gentleness as powerful, it doesn't suggest weakness, as some people might think. It's not passive. We are still called to respond to things and change the world through our gentleness. And it's powerful in that way. It's not a lack of taking action. It's not passive, so we're correcting and restoring and we're defending still through our gentleness. And I think that it becomes a more effective way for us to take that action because it demonstrates great power and our self-control. We see that God is gentle. Matthew 11:29, God says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest from your souls." So we see God's gentleness to us.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
And it gives us rest. We strive and we toil for so much in our lives, but because of God's gentleness, we don't have to do that. Thank God for that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So just a few other ways that we see gentleness in the Bible. We see that Jesus was gentle. When he came to earth as a baby. If we're going to talk about aggression causing aggression or gentleness causing gentleness, Jesus came as a baby. He didn't come as this harsh and overpowering ruler, because that probably would have caused even more hatred toward him and even more distance between him and his enemies. But instead he came gently, which drew us and everybody else to him, or so many others to him. He was gentle when he was willing to go to the cross. He, with all the power and strength that he had, right, he could have just attacked his attackers and said, "Nope, I'm not interested in going to the cross right now. I'm going to go do something else," and could have sent them to the cross, but didn't. He was willing to do that. We see Paul being gentle. Again, he could have attacked those who put him in jail, but Paul instead went to jail and wrote his letters from there, and God still used him in mighty ways. And we see that David was gentle with Saul, despite all the times that Saul tried to kill David. David gently let Saul finish off his reign and waited until God showed him it was his time. There we see that meekness right there. David had strength, but he submitted to God's control instead, and so was gentle. So, did you have any other thoughts about gentleness that came to your mind as I asked you to do this?
As you were just talking about that, I was reminded of Linda Motter's parenting conversations from the years, and she uses this beautiful example of kids being in dirt. You know, they're just a seed in dirt, and you would never force open a plant, or you can't force them to grow, but you just change the things around them. People are just like that. I love her illustration. But it's through gentleness. It's through giving them the right things. It's through providing them the right nourishment. It's through changing things, tweaking things, trimming. You know, that's how we let a plant grow and flourish and grow into what they're meant to be, is through that gentle caring.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I continue to look at you as an example of a gentle spirit that I want more to be like, and I see the difference it makes in your kids from where they were when they first came into your home to where they are now. The way that they respond to you is just amazing. So I know it's hard to do, and you don't feel like you do it perfectly.
Oh, I know. I don't do it perfectly.
None of us does, but I think you're making amazing strides in changing their story dramatically, and it's so inspiring to see.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for asking me to
Of course.
be part of these conversations.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next week.